So we're going to talk about the atomic bomb and the debate around it, the issues going into it, and the decision of Harry Truman to ultimately to use it. So here we go. All right, so we've been talking a lot about the war in the Pacific, and you guys should hopefully understand that our policy of island hopping had been pretty successful. We had made it to the Philippines, and then in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, we secured the Philippines, returned. So then Iwo Jima and Okinawa were those two majorly vital stepping stones to Japan, and they were going to be needed for what many people thought was inevitable, which was an invasion of Japan. So what we'll see, though, is that the Japanese proved at Iwo Jima and Okinawa that they were, just as they had been, fierce fighters and nowhere near surrendering, even though the United States lost about 18,000 men at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but the Japanese lost 90,000. And they still weren't surrendering, So by 1945 here, Germany is on the verge of, or had just basically surrendered, and Japan didn't care. They still said, well, we're still going to continue to fight. And, it doesn't matter to us that Germany's out. So that, along with sort of the culture and the history of Japan, with that whole idea of the cult of Bushido and just this idea that you do not surrender. Surrender is devastating. It's more dishonorable than being killed. So that is something that we knew was going to make it extremely difficult to successfully invade and defeat Japan. So we had an invasion date set. It was going to be November 1st, 1945, and the planned invasions, though, were going to have massive casualties on both sides. I've seen the numbers as high as 500,000 to 1 million. I've seen them lower. I've seen some historians say it probably would have taken, 50,000 to 100,000 American soldiers to successfully invade Japan. I think ultimately, though, that number, regardless of what side it's on, is really high. It's higher than D-Day, and D-Day, of course, was bad enough. So we were very concerned. President Truman's really concerned about that. And the other thing that concerned Truman is that he's afraid that, every Japanese man, woman, and child could possibly arm themselves here. So the Japanese total lives lost was going to be really high. So these are things he's thinking about. Pros of the bomb, what's the benefit of using this? Well, first off, little to no American lives are going to need to be lost, which is obviously a very good thing. And that's because of the fact that we wouldn't need an invasion. The other thing this bomb is going to do, hopefully, was get that unconditional surrender that we were so pushing for. That was something Truman felt really strongly about. That's something he's going to get the Soviet Union and England on board with at that Potsdam Ultimatum. And hopefully would save lives even for the Japanese too, versus a full-scale invasion. So those were kind of the pros. Now the cons in 1945, you got to remember, we obviously know a lot more than they did in 1945. But even in 1945, a lot of the scientists working on that Manhattan Project were saying, trust us, you don't want to do this. You don't want to go here. Once we go down this road, we can never go back. And so the long-term effects were really unknown. And a lot of the scientists weren't even sure it was going to work in the way they intended it to. And then, of course, just the fact that there are going to be lots of civilian casualties. There are going to be a lot of Japanese that aren't wearing uniforms that are going to be killed in a pretty horrific way. So I think a lot of people think it was more cut and dry than it was. I know growing up, I only really heard, well, either we used the bomb or we invaded. There was actually an option C. And option C was something that Dwight Eisenhower and even some of the admirals in the Navy were saying, and that is Japan is virtually defeated already. We've firebombed the heck out of Tokyo. We've taken away all the islands. Japan's a series of islands. All we need to do is set up a good blockade around them and continue the firebomb raids. And eventually they're going to have to surrender. So some people were pushing for that, saying we don't really need an invasion or a bomb. We could just do a successful blockade. But ultimately, I think President Truman says, I want this quick. I want this over quick. This war's gone on long enough, and I think this is a good thing because it's going to end the war quickly with the least amount of lives lost. Let's take a look at Truman's diary entry from July 25th, 1945. So he's saying here, we think we have found a way to cause the disintegration of the atom. And then he goes on to talk about here what they had done in the New Mexico desert. An experiment in the New Mexico desert was startling, to put it mildly. 13 pounds of the explosive caused the complete disintegration of a steel tower 60 feet high, created a crater 6 feet deep and 1,200 feet in diameter, knocked over a steel tower a half a mile away, and knocked men down 10,000 yards away. The explosion was visible for more than 200 miles and audible for 40 miles and more. That was 13 pounds, guys. The bombs that we drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were over 2,000 pounds. So you can imagine how powerful this thing is. Now, notice here what Truman says. He's picking a city that is not the old capital or the new. He does that on purpose. He doesn't want a city that's too historical with 1,000-year-old Shinto and Buddhist temples. He's trying to avoid that, but he's also trying to avoid the biggest city in Japan, which of course is Tokyo. He wants a city, though, that's big enough. I mean, you got to make a city that's big enough that it's going to hurt. So he says, let's pick a military city. He also says we're going to issue a warning statement. But remember, in that warning, he tells Japan to surrender or you will be destroyed. Japan, thinking they're going to be destroyed, they think that Truman means it's an invasion. One of the big question marks we talked about in class was, what if Truman had said, look, here's the pictures, here's the evidence of what we just did in New Mexico with a 13-pound bomb. We've got a 2,000-pound bomb with your name on it. Surrender or you'll be destroyed. Would they have surrendered? It's hard to tell. I mean, considering the fact that Japan hadn't surrendered already, all signs point to probably no, but they didn't really have that particular choice. They were thinking it was an invasion. Now, we don't want to deny the fact that some of this is political too. I mean, Truman sees a chance here, especially at Potsdam, to make a statement to Stalin, and he does, as you can see, casually mention to Stalin that we had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. The Russian premier showed no special interest. All he said was he was glad to hear it and hoped he would make good use of it against the Japanese. He doesn't say what it is, okay? So later on, Stalin's going to be a little annoyed about that. He felt like Truman was kind of hiding it. So when you look at what Winston Churchill, also at Potsdam, said, as we were waiting for our cars, I found myself here near Truman. How did it go? I asked. He never asked a question, he replied. I was certain, therefore, that at that date Stalin had no special knowledge of the vast process of research upon which the United States and Britain had been engaged for so long. So Churchill's saying, kind of, hey, did you tell him? And Truman says, well, I told him, but he didn't really ask much. And I think that you can definitely see as sort of this drama is kind of going on and unfolding that some of this probably was political. Obviously it's not the main decision. The main decision is military, and it was to save lives. But I think you can't argue with the fact that by using this bomb, it was showing Stalin something too. It was showing Stalin something too. Now, I always compare in class Hiroshima, the city of Hiroshima, to what Dayton, Ohio, in about the size and scope of it. Dayton, it's a military city. There's Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is there. So there's a high concentration of military presence in Dayton, but there's also a lot of civilians in Dayton. So, think about that. Think about that when we're talking about the destruction of Hiroshima. So the first bomb is dropped on August 6, 1945. Instantly incinerates the whole city. We've got thousands of people that are dead. This is a charcoal remains of someone. This is the thing about these bombs. They're so hot and powerful, and we're, 70% water, that there's no, right near the epicenter, there's not even anything left of you. There's just a carbon imprint where you once were. Farther away from the epicenter, though, we're talking life-threatening, disfiguring burns, head to toe. And so that's the instant effects. And then, of course, the radiation poisoning is going to be long-term effects, the cancer rates, the birth defects, the fact that this gets in the groundwater, all the things the scientists were sort of predicting. That just kind of really tragic side effects here of the use of this bomb. So when we didn't hear from Japan, that's when Truman ordered that second bomb in Nagasaki, and also similar casualties. We've got about 64,000 people killed instantly, not to mention the people who will die from complications within months or years after. That's when Japan finally said, okay, enough, we surrender. And so on August 14th is when VJ Day, when Truman said he got that unconditional surrender from Japan. They make it official on the ship, the USS Missouri, on September 2nd of that year. But we definitely see that these bombs, without a doubt, saved American lives. And they're going to cause a whole new war, though. And we're going to see that. That's what the Cold War is going to do. Stalin undoubtedly sees how powerful these are, not just from a military standpoint, but a political standpoint. And he makes it his mission to get an atomic bomb, and he will successfully to test one in 1949. So it's going to cause a whole new war, and the world will never be the same again. And every president is going to have to ask themselves from 1949 on, is what I'm doing risking nuclear war? And therefore, is what I'm doing worth nuclear war? And it's something that we still deal with today. So that is how World War II ended in Japan.